They were the funniest two men in America. For 10 years, they had made the nation laugh until it hurt. Pratfalls and crooning, chaos and cool, the monkey and the matador. 40 million people tuned in every week to watch them. Paramount paid them more money than any comedy team in history. Teenagers screamed their names. Columnists predicted they would never end. But on the night of July 25, 1956, in a dressing room at the Copacabana in New York City, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis sat on opposite sides of the room and did not speak. The show was over. The applause was still echoing down the hallway, and the two men who had built an empire on laughter could not find a single word to say to each other. A waiter who worked the Copa that night, a young man named Vincent who had served them champagne 100 times before, said he saw Dean leave through the service entrance around 1 a.m. No entourage, no photographers, just a man in a tuxedo walking alone into the summer heat, his bow tie undone, his collar open. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He did not look back. Vincent said Dean's face was the strangest thing. Not angry, not sad, but empty. Like a house with all the lights off, he said years later. Like nobody was home. Jerry left 20 minutes after. He took the front entrance, where the press was waiting. He smiled. He waved. He made a joke about needing sleep. The flashbulbs popped, and the reporters laughed, and Jerry Lewis performed one last time for the cameras. But a photographer from the Daily News, a man who had covered them since 1948, noticed something wrong. Jerry's eyes were red. His hands were shaking, and when someone asked about Dean, Jerry's smile flickered for just a moment before he said, "Dean's a wonderful talent. We wish each other well." It was the kind of sentence you say when you have nothing left to say. Here is what the world knew. Martin and Lewis were breaking up. The papers had been speculating for months. There had been rumors of arguments, of jealousy, of creative differences. Hollywood had seen partnerships dissolve before, but here is what the world did not know. In that dressing room, after the last show, Dean Martin had looked at Jerry Lewis, his partner, his meal ticket, his brother, and said 4 words. "I can't do this. Not I won't. Not I'm leaving. Not an accusation or a demand. Just I can't do this." Jerry had stared at him. The silence lasted a long time. Then Dean stood up, put on his jacket, and walked out the door. He did not explain what this meant. He did not need to. 10 years of standing in Jerry's shadow had made the explanation unnecessary. Jerry sat alone in that dressing room for almost an hour after Dean left. A cleaning woman who came in to empty the ashtrays found him there, still in his costume, staring at the mirror. She asked if he was all right. He said yes. But she noticed he was holding a cufflink, one of the matching pair Dean had given him for their 5th anniversary, holding it so tight his knuckles had gone white. She did not ask about it. Some things are too private to name. This is a story about two men who loved each other, but could never say so. This is a story about what happens when the applause stops and the lights go down, and you realize that the person standing next to you for 10 years is a stranger. This is a story about the silence between partners. The silence that lasted 20 years. July 25th, 1956 was their 10th anniversary. 10 years to the day since a skinny crooner and a manic comic had first shared a stage at the 500 Club in Atlantic City. 10 years of radio shows and record albums and 16 films and a television program that changed the medium forever. 10 years of hotels and airplanes and arguments and reconciliations and the strange intimacy that comes from making people laugh together, night after night, in city after city. They had planned a celebration. Paramount had wanted to throw a party. The Copa had offered a special show. Jerry had commissioned matching watches, engraved with the date. But somewhere between the planning and the performance, the celebration became a funeral. Nobody remembers exactly when. Nobody wants to. The paradox of that night is simple. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis were saying goodbye, but neither of them knew how. They had spent a decade finishing each other's sentences. They had invented a language of looks and timing that no one else could speak. They had been so close that journalists called them a marriage. But they had never learned to talk. Not really, not about the things that mattered. And so they ended the way they began, on a stage, in front of strangers, performing a version of themselves that had nothing to do with who they really were. The funniest two men in America, the saddest two men in the room. To understand how they broke, you must first understand how they were built. Atlantic City, July 1946. The 500 Club on Missouri Avenue. A cramped, smoky showroom run by a man named Skinny D'Amato, who had connections to people you didn't ask about. Dean Martin was the opening act, a 30-year-old singer from Steubenville, Ohio, with a voice like warm velvet and a career that wasn't going anywhere. Jerry Lewis was 19. He had a record act, lip-syncing to phonograph records while making faces. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't art, but something about the kid's energy filled a room in a way that couldn't be taught. The story of how they met has been told 1,000 times, and each telling is different. What matters is this: by the second night, they were improvising together. By the third night, the audience was screaming. By the end of the week, Skinny D'Amato had torn up their separate contracts and written a new one. Martin and Lewis. The act was born. A waitress who worked the 500 Club during that first week. A woman named Rose, who later moved to Florida and rarely spoke of those years, said she watched the two of them discover each other in real time. It was like watching two people fall in love, she said. Not romantic love, something else. They found each other, and suddenly neither one of them was alone anymore. Dean had been alone for a long time. He had grown up poor, the son of an Italian barber who barely spoke English. He had worked the steel mills. He had dealt cards in back rooms. He had sung in roadhouses where the customers threw things if they didn't like you. By 1946, he had a failed first marriage, a handful of moderate records, and a growing suspicion that maybe he didn't have what it took. Then Jerry walked into his life. And suddenly, Dean Martin was the straight man to the funniest kid in America. Suddenly, people were paying attention. Suddenly the rooms got bigger, and the money got better, and the future looked like something you might actually want to see. Jerry needed Dean too. He just didn't know it yet. The dynamic was established early. Jerry was the chaos. Dean was the calm. Jerry mugged and screamed and climbed the curtains. Dean stood to the side, cigarette in hand, watching with an expression of bemused tolerance, as if he had wandered into a lunatic asylum and decided to stay for the entertainment. It worked. God, how it worked. Within 2 years, they were the biggest act in nightclubs. Within 4 years, they were movie stars. Within 6 years, they had a television show that drew audiences larger than anything in the history of the medium. But somewhere in the machinery of success, something started to rot. A producer at Paramount who worked on their early films, a man named Hal who had been in the business since the silent era, said he noticed the imbalance almost immediately. The studio saw Jerry, he said. They saw the face, the energy, the kid appeal. Dean was furniture, good-looking furniture, but furniture. The meetings were always about Jerry. The scripts were written for Jerry. The publicity focused on Jerry. Dean would sit in the back of the room, smoking, saying nothing. When someone asked his opinion, the room would go quiet, not because they wanted to hear it, but because they were surprised he was still there. He took it, Hal said. Year after year, he took it. But I watched his eyes sometimes. When Jerry was doing his thing and everyone was laughing, Dean's eyes weren't laughing. What was in those eyes? Hal thought about it for a moment before answering. Distance, he said, like he was already somewhere else. The newspapers made it worse. They called the act Jerry Lewis in headlines, with "and Dean Martin" in smaller type below. They wrote profiles of Jerry, the boy genius, the physical comedian, the heir to Chaplin. They wrote about Dean as if he were a pleasant accessory, a handsome face to balance Jerry's rubber features. A journalist from Variety, who interviewed them in 1953, said Dean handled every question with grace, deflecting, joking, giving Jerry the spotlight. But afterward, in the hallway, the journalist saw Dean standing alone by a window, looking out at the Paramount lot. "Mr. Martin," the journalist said. "Everything all right?" Dean turned, smiled, the smile that made women melt. "Everything's fine, pal," he said, "just counting the buildings." The journalist didn't understand. Years later, he thought he did. Dean was counting the buildings that Jerry's talent had built, and wondering which ones would still be standing if he walked away. There were good years. This must be said, because the ending was not the whole story. There were years when Dean and Jerry were genuinely brothers, sharing hotel rooms to save money, finishing each other's jokes, calling each other at midnight just to talk. There were years when Jerry looked at Dean with undisguised worship, and Dean looked at Jerry with something like paternal pride. A grip who worked on the caddy in 1953 remembered a moment between takes when Jerry stumbled on a cable and nearly fell. Dean caught him with a quickness that suggested he had been watching, waiting, ready. Jerry laughed it off, but Dean held his arm for an extra second, making sure he was steady. That was the thing about Dean, the grip said. He was always watching, always making sure Jerry was okay, like a big brother who doesn't say much but notices everything. So what went wrong? The answer is complicated, because it wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of small wounds. The meetings where Dean wasn't consulted, the reviews that praised Jerry and mentioned Dean as an afterthought, the scripts that gave Jerry all the jokes and Dean all the songs, as if singing were a commercial break from the real entertainment. It was the way Jerry started directing their films without the title, overriding the actual directors, making decisions about camera angles and timing while Dean stood off to the side. It was the way Jerry gave interviews about his vision for their act, as if Dean were a prop in Jerry's theater. It was the way the world saw them. Jerry, the genius. Dean, the straight man. Dean never complained. He smiled. He sang. He hit his marks. But a costume designer who worked with them for 6 years said she once found Dean in his dressing room between scenes, holding an unlit cigarette and staring at nothing. "I'm the most famous unknown man in America," he said, not looking at her. She didn't know if he meant for her to hear it. She never forgot it. By 1955, the partnership was dying. They still performed together, still made movies together, still appeared on each other's television shows. But the electricity was gone. The timing was off by half a beat. The looks they exchanged on stage were no longer improvised. They were performed, rehearsed, mechanical. A musician who played in their orchestra during the final tour said you could hear it in the silences. "Comedy is timing," he said, "and timing is trust." By the end, they didn't trust each other anymore. You could hear the gap where the trust used to be. Jerry started doing benefits without Dean. Dean started taking solo singing engagements. The press noticed. The questions started. Are Martin and Lewis breaking up? They denied it. They denied it again. They denied it until the denial became a performance of its own. 2 men insisting they were fine while the house burned down around them. The last year was the hardest. A secretary at Paramount, who handled their correspondence, said the memos between their offices that were 50 feet apart, became increasingly formal. Mr. Martin requests. Mr. Lewis suggests, as if they were strangers negotiating a business deal. She said Dean stopped coming to the lot most days. Jerry noticed. Of course Jerry noticed. But he didn't call, didn't visit, didn't ask what was wrong. "I think he was scared," the secretary said. Scared that if he asked, Dean would tell him the truth, and the truth would end everything. It was going to end anyway. Some truths are patient. They wait until you're ready. Then they wait a little longer. Then they stop waiting. And then came the night at the Copa, July 25th, 1956. 10 years. The dressing room, the silence. "I can't do this." And 20 years of not speaking. The world expected Dean Martin to fail. Without Jerry, he was just a singer, a good singer maybe, but the business was full of good singers. The columnists gave him 6 months. The studio executives quietly canceled his contract. The betting in Hollywood was that Dean Martin would fade into lounge work and nostalgia tours, another straight man who lost his comic and lost his way. They were wrong. Within 2 years, Dean had reinvented himself. He took dramatic roles that no one expected. He made The Young Lions with Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift, and the critics who had dismissed him were suddenly paying attention. He recorded Volare and That's Amore, and became a bigger recording star than he had ever been with Jerry. He joined Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. and became the coolest man in the Rat Pack. He got his own television show, The Dean Martin Show, and it ran for 9 years, winning Emmy after Emmy. Dean Martin, it turned out, had not been furniture. He had been a man waiting for permission to be himself. But success did not heal the wound. A wardrobe assistant who worked on The Dean Martin Show for 7 years said Dean never mentioned Jerry. Not once. Not in conversation. Not in jokes. Not in the casual backstage chatter where old stories usually surface. It was like Jerry didn't exist, she said. Like those 10 years had been erased from his memory. But she noticed something else. Whenever Jerry Lewis appeared on another channel doing a telethon, promoting a film, Dean would quietly leave the room. He wouldn't say anything. He would just stand up, make an excuse, and disappear until the segment was over. He couldn't watch, she said. Couldn't stand to see him. But I don't think it was anger. It was something else. She thought about it for a long time. Grief, she said finally. I think it was grief, like seeing a picture of someone who died. Jerry's career followed a different trajectory. He became a director, respected, ambitious, occasionally brilliant. He made The Nutty Professor and The Bellboy, and films that are still studied in cinema schools. He was hailed in France as a genius, compared to Chaplin, given awards and retrospectives. But in America, something had dimmed. Without Dean to balance him, Jerry's energy could tip into excess. The manic routines that had seemed endearing next to Dean's cool began to feel exhausting on their own. The box office declined. The television appearances grew less frequent. Jerry worked constantly. He was not a man who knew how to stop. But the easy success of the partnership years never quite returned, and he never stopped talking about Dean. This was the asymmetry that defined their silence. Dean never mentioned Jerry. Jerry could not stop mentioning Dean. In interviews, in memoirs, in late-night conversations with anyone who would listen, Jerry returned again and again to the partnership, to the breakup, to the wounds that had never healed. Dean was my brother, he told a reporter in 1971. We were closer than brothers, and then one day it was over, and I never understood why. A friend of Jerry's from the Friars Club said Jerry kept a photograph of Dean in his study, not displayed prominently, tucked into a bookshelf, half hidden behind a trophy. But it was there. He'd look at it sometimes, the friend said, when he thought no one was watching. Just look at it, not say anything. Dean, as far as anyone knew, kept nothing. He had moved on, or he had buried it so deep that even he couldn't find it anymore. The silence lasted 20 years. 20 years of living in the same city, working in the same industry, attending the same parties, and never speaking. 20 years of mutual friends trying to broker reconciliations that never happened. 20 years of journalists asking, "Will you ever work with Dean Jerry again?" and receiving polite deflections. What kept them apart? Pride. Probably. The fear of admitting need. The suspicion that if they opened the door, all the old wounds would come flooding back. But also something simpler. Neither of them knew how to start. Dean had never been a man who talked about his feelings. Jerry had never learned to apologize without explaining. The language they had shared for 10 years, the language of timing and looks and trust, had been a performance language, not a real one. When the performance ended, they discovered they had no words. And then came Frank. Frank Sinatra was the only man in America who could have done what he did on September 6, 1976. He had known them both since the early days. He had watched the partnership rise and fall. He had stayed friends with Dean through the Rat Pack years and remained cordial with Jerry, despite their different orbits. And Frank Sinatra did not believe in unfinished business. The MDA Labor Day Telethon was Jerry's baby, a charity marathon he hosted every year, raising millions for muscular dystrophy research. It was Jerry's redemption, his proof that the comic who had faded still mattered, still had something to give. That year, Frank was a guest. He walked on stage, sang a few songs, bantered with Jerry. Then he said something that made Jerry freeze. "I have a friend here. Someone who loves what you do for the kids every year. Someone who wants to come out and say hello." Jerry's face went pale. He knew. The audience didn't know. The crew didn't know. But Jerry knew. And then Dean Martin walked onto the stage. You can find it online. Grainy, overexposed, the colors bleeding at the edges. But you can see what happened. Dean walked out with his usual ease, his usual half-smile, his usual air of bemused detachment. He looked at Jerry. Jerry looked at him. And then Jerry started to cry. Not discreetly. Not like a man in control of himself. Jerry Lewis wept openly, his shoulders shaking, his hands covering his face, while Dean stood there and waited. The audience, 40 million people watching at home, went silent. Then Dean spoke. "So," he said, "you working hard?" It was a nothing line. A throwaway. The kind of thing you say when you have nothing to say. But it was Dean's voice, saying it to Jerry. And that was everything. They embraced. The audience erupted, and for one moment, 20 years of silence melted away. But here is what the cameras didn't show. The embrace lasted a long time. A stage manager standing in the wings said Dean held on longer than Jerry did. Said Dean's eyes were closed. Said his hands gripped Jerry's jacket like a man holding onto something he was afraid to lose again. When they separated, Dean whispered something. Jerry nodded. Neither of them ever said what it was. The reunion did not fix everything. This is the part the story usually leaves out. Dean and Jerry did not become partners again. They did not become close friends. They saw each other occasionally. A dinner here, a phone call there. But the easy intimacy of the early years never returned. Too much time had passed. Too much silence had accumulated. They were different men now, shaped by different decades, carrying different wounds. The boys who had found each other at the 500 Club were gone. In their place were two old performers, tired and wary, who remembered what it felt like to be brothers but could not quite remember how. A mutual friend who saw them together at a party in 1983 said it was heartbreaking to watch. They were polite, he said, warm, even, but there was this distance, like they were standing on opposite sides of a window. They could see each other. They just couldn't touch. Dean died on Christmas Day, 1995. Jerry did not attend the funeral. He said later that he couldn't, that it would have been too much, that he had said his goodbyes in his own way, privately, and that was enough. But a reporter who interviewed Jerry a few months after Dean's death said Jerry wept during the conversation, wept and could not stop. I loved him, Jerry said. I never stopped loving him. I just didn't know how to tell him. The reporter asked if Dean had known. Jerry was quiet for a long time. I hope so, he said finally. I hope he knew. Jerry Lewis lived another 22 years. He worked until he couldn't work anymore, performing, directing, hosting the telethon, until his health made it impossible. He married twice. He raised children. He built a life that looked, from the outside, full and successful. But those who knew him said Dean never left his thoughts. In interviews, even in his 80s, Jerry would circle back to the partnership, to Atlantic City, to the way Dean's voice sounded on those early recordings, to the rhythm they had discovered together, that thing that could not be taught or replicated or explained. People ask me about my career, Jerry told a journalist in 2012. But the career was just what happened after Dean. Everything before, that was my life. A lighting technician who worked Jerry's final Las Vegas shows in 2015 said there was a moment, one night, when Jerry paused mid-routine and looked at the empty stool beside him, just looked at it. The audience didn't understand. But Jerry's face, in that moment, was not performing. It was remembering. Who was he looking at? Someone asked afterward. The technician didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jerry Lewis died on August 20th, 2017. He was 91 years old. The obituaries celebrated his genius, his legacy, his contributions to comedy and charity. They mentioned the partnership with Dean Martin. Of course they did. But mostly they focused on Jerry alone, the director, the humanitarian, the last of a generation. But if you read carefully, you could find the other story. The story of a man who spent 60 years missing his brother. The story of a silence that was never quite broken. The story of two men who built something beautiful together and then walked away from it and spent the rest of their lives wondering what would have happened if they had stayed. The matching cufflinks that Dean gave Jerry for their 5th anniversary, the ones Jerry was holding in the dressing room that last night at the Copa, were found among Jerry's possessions after his death. He had kept them for 61 years. One was slightly tarnished. The other was bright, as if he had been polishing it all those years, keeping it ready, in case Dean ever asked for it back. In the end, what Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis left behind was not the films or the television shows or the records that made them famous. It was something harder to name. It was the image of two men who found each other when they were young and hungry and alone, and who built a language together that made the world laugh. It was the image of that language breaking down, word by word, until nothing was left but silence. It was the image of Frank Sinatra walking Dean onto a stage in 1976, and Jerry weeping because his brother had come back. It was the hope that some wounds can heal, and the knowledge that some can't. The 500 Club in Atlantic City is gone now. The building burned down in 1973. and nothing was built in its place. If you go to Missouri Avenue today, you'll find an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, surrounded by a chain-link fence. But sometimes, late at night, people say they can still hear the music. A crooner's voice, smooth as velvet. A comic's laugh, high and wild. And the sound of two men discovering for the first time that they were not alone. Some partnerships end. Some silences last forever. But the music stays. It echoes in the spaces between words, in the pauses between jokes, in the breath a performer takes before the next line. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis made music together for 10 years. Then they made silence for 20. And then for one night in 1976, they made music again. Just for a moment, just long enough to remember what they had lost. That moment is still out there somewhere, on a grainy videotape, in the memory of 40 million people who watched, in the space between two men who loved each other but never learned how to say so. The echo never really stops. It just gets quieter and quieter, until only the ones who were listening can hear it anymore.